Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about Esther.
I love the book of Esther. This is one of my favorites in the whole Bible. And I don't say that at the expense of anything else in the Bible. Obviously, I really like the whole thing. I mean, look what we're doing here as an exercise. But this one has a little different feel to it because it's just a straight up story. And it is a great story. It has all of the elements of all the great stories that you and I love and that transcend genre and that transcend culture and language and region and time. This is one of the all-time greats. Even if there's no Bible, even if hypothetically that didn't exist, I still think Esther would be a great all-time classic story because of how perfectly structured it is. It's got all the elements. It's got a neat, tidy beginning and middle and end. You can follow the flow of the story. You can feel the tension ebb and flow at a perfect pace. It's got colorful, vibrant, compromised characters who you can relate to and you can understand their motives, but they've all also got a degree of unpredictability and multifacetedness. It's got a strong lead character who just happens to also be a strong female lead character. I think that makes it stand out from a lot of other ancient literature. But rather than her being some kind of simplistic Mary Sue who just sort of feels like a lecture to the audience for not liking shows that feature women quite enough, instead, we get a dynamic, complicated, compromised character here who has issues that are external to her, but also issues that are internal to her that she has to overcome. That's a character you can relate to. And frankly, people who write stories today could probably use to take a few notes on how to properly write a female character from what we're seeing here in Esther. There's a reason she is beloved through the ages, as this book is beloved through the ages. But in addition to that, the story also has a creepy, nasty, snidely, evil villain. But the villain is pretty gifted. But that bad guy is ultimately going to have a fatal flaw that Esther doesn't have. Esther can overcome, with the help of other people and maybe discreetly from God, she can overcome the problems she has within. Haman also has problems within, but he can't overcome them. He gives in to them. He can't grow. He can't change. And so he'll fall victim to his own devices. That's great storytelling. But another reason that Esther works so well is that it has stakes. You care. Stakes. That's a good one, Whitman. I'm going to keep that. It was an accident, but it stays. What I mean is it has stakes, like there's something in play. The plot doesn't work out the way you want it to work out, characters you care about and so much more are going to suffer a horrible fate. And so anytime you're looking at a story, if it's a good story, you care about the outcome. There's something in play. Another reason I think this is a beloved story for the ages is the thematic material. Think about it. Every great story you've ever really sunk your teeth into, it has maybe multiple levels of themes and points, maybe even a little bit of a moral. But it's not so on the nose that you just have to be like, oh, there it was. I can take or leave that proposition. No, the authors of the great stories give you a little bit of room to stew on it, to ruminate on it, to consider it from different angles. And the great stories might hit you in different ways at different times. You might relate to different characters at different times in your life. And Esther gives us all of that. The book of Esther is set in Persia under the reign of King Xerxes. Oh, no. I'm forgetting something really important before we get into the actual summary here. God doesn't come up in this book, which is crazy because it's in the Bible. And the book thematically seems to have a lot to do with the providence of God, but he doesn't get mentioned, doesn't even really get alluded to in this book. More on that in a minute. Okay, back to the summary. This is set in Persia. King Xerxes is the third prominent king of Persia. Well, what we know from this time is really actually quite a bit. There are a lot of sources on the lives of Darius and Xerxes, one in particular, a Greek guy living under Persian rule named Herodotus, who is the father of history. He's the first one who really spun great historical tales with middling accuracy by modern standards, but with excellent delivery by ancient standards. And we know that Darius had a problem with the far west end of his empire getting out into Turkey and toward Greek territory. He couldn't control the Athenians and the Spartans on the Aegean Sea. And the Athenians and the Spartans and some other Greek cities, they kept messing with Greekish Persian cities in modern-day Turkey. And Darius was like, enough. I'm just going to go out and crush these little fleas. And he went to do it, but it didn't really work. And then he died, and kind of like David passed on some grudges to Solomon, so Darius passed on some grudges to Xerxes. And the book of Esther opens with Xerxes planning a gigantic campaign, the biggest the world would ever see, to go and teach those dirty Greeks a lesson. Now, if you remember anything from your Western Civ class or from Zack Snyder's 300, you know that this is the campaign where Xerxes ran into Leonidas and the 300 Spartans who are enshrined in legend as holding the pass of Thermopylae to bravely and self-sacrificially buy time as the Persian horde was marching on Athens, and the Athenians were able to evacuate their city and ready a naval defense under the brave leadership of Themistocles. All of those details, or most of those details, are gleaned from the storytelling of Herodotus. And regardless of how biased Herodotus might have been one way or another, he gives us enough details that we can triangulate that probably this king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as Herodotus called him, it's the Greekification of his Persian name, this guy was probably putting together a war council at the beginning of the book of Esther to prepare for that campaign. So this story by the anonymous author of the book of Esther is set against the backdrop of this super well-known, gigantic, global, historical, political, military event that is about to unfold. And that failure of Xerxes to go and correct the Greeks might be a little ha-ha, rib-rib, nod-nod about how impotent Xerxes is imagined to be by some of the intended audience of this book. Well, whatever the case, Xerxes comes off as pretty silly early on in the book. He's trying to impress everybody. Everybody gets liquored up, and Xerxes is like, all right, let me bring out my super attractive wife, and maybe we'll have her do a little sexy dance to entertain everybody. But the queen, Vashti, is having none of it. It's like, no, I'm not doing that. And Xerxes, who theoretically is the big decision maker around here, gets easily influenced by alcohol and others to depose his queen in a rash move, issue an edict about all the men in Persia. They need to crack down on their misbehaving wives and quit being so influenced by him, which is kind of funny because he's going to be influenced for good by his wife in just a few chapters. And he deposes the queen and then decides to have a contest to pick a replacement queen. Now, the winner of this contest probably wouldn't be the only queen. It looks like Xerxes probably had multiple queens and concubines, if you will. But this is still a really high-stakes deal, and whoever wins is going to ascend to the throne, the position of queen of the world. And that's when we meet a couple of Jewish exiles named Mordecai, who's older, and his younger cousin, Hadassah, or Esther is the name she uses in a Persian context. Mordecai seems to be a man of influence, and he becomes aware of this contest, and he's like, Esther, you are going to sign up for the contest, and you're going to win. And dang it, she does right from the beginning. She's got a way with the court attendants, and she wins the favor of all the people who are kind of behind the scenes in this contest. Esther, who is awesome, but also a compromised character. I mean, she and her family haven't gone back to be a part of the rebuilding of the temple and the reestablishing of sacrifices and the rebuilding of the walls back in Jerusalem. They've chosen to stay in Persia. There's something they like about it. It's kind of working for them there. And that's okay. But there would have been varied opinions on that amongst the original audience as to what they should have done. Well, Esther wins and is made queen, which is a crazy reversal because she's an exile whose family was taken there by force, and now she's risen all the way to this crazy high position. That's amazing. Has some overtones of like Joseph back in Egypt, or Nehemiah, who would serve Xerxes' son Artaxerxes. Well, it's about this time that we get introduced to someone who is descended from one of the age-old enemies of the Jewish people, that being Haman. He's an Agagite or an Amalekite. That is, he's a Canaanite enemy of the Jewish people, going all the way back to the reign of King Saul. But grudges don't go away fast in the ancient world, and Haman, who has the favor of the king and is a very high-ranking court official, gets really grouchy when Mordecai the Jew reveals that he's a Jew and won't bow down to Haman. That's enough to provoke Haman and to make him want to abuse his royal court power to dispose not just of Mordecai, but of the Jews in general. So in keeping with his Canaanite ways, he appeals to fate and pagan deities by rolling a dice to let them decide what would be the best day to enact this purge, this effectively genocide against the Jews, using the power of Xerxes, who Haman then bilks into signing a decree without looking at it carefully that would bring about said genocide. Well, now it's just a matter of time. It's a race against the clock as to whether this date is going to come to pass or whether someone can intervene. But who's in a position to intervene? There's nobody in a position of influence to help the situation who cares about the fate of the Jewish people other than Queen Esther. And she's initially very balky about it. But Mordecai, who's already demonstrated that he has an ear to the ground and he's a pretty shrewd guy, he now turns that shrewdness to making sure that his cousin, Esther, the queen, will take action to defend her people. In so many words, he says, if this thing goes down, people are going to find out you were Jewish and you'll perish like the rest of us just in the palace. And then he seems to quickly switch tone to something a little more nurturing and points to the providence of God, famously saying, maybe you were appointed to this spot for a time such as this. Esther has a change of heart and decides that she will indeed act, and she musters her courage and she goes before the king, who receives her. This is huge. But rather than just going to the king and being like, you issued a stupid order, unmake it, she and we already know that Xerxes doesn't respond well to this kind of confrontational tone from his wife. So instead, she sets up a trap to counteract Haman's trap. She throws a couple of banquets. Over the course of that, providentially, in between the two banquets, the king can't sleep one night and he's like, you know what, read me some stuff about what's going on in the kingdom. And he gets reminded of Mordecai the Jew saving his life. He's like, yeah, we should honor him. Well, next morning, Haman comes in and the king's like, what should be done for somebody in whom the king delights? And Haman's like, he's probably talking about me. Well, he should be paraded around through town and dressed up all fancy and told the king delights in him. And Xerxes is like, awesome, Mordecai the Jew, that's who I delight in. Go parade him around town. And this is the pivot point of the book where all of the fortunes start to change towards something better. Well, in the second banquet that Haman and the king are invited to, Esther reveals that she's a Jew and is like, this guy right over here, Haman, is trying to sell me and my people out and is using trickery to deceive you. And the king's like, what the heck? And then Haman miscalculates and tries to persuade Esther in a way that maybe involves physical intimidation. And the king catches it happening and is like, what the heck are you doing with my wife, dude? And it ends up that the stake that was stuck in the ground with a point that Haman had intended to impale Mordecai on ends up getting used on Haman instead. And then Esther, with the wisdom of Mordecai, is able to figure out a way to get the king to issue a decree that doesn't countermand one of his already existing decrees. Apparently, you couldn't do that in Persia if you were a king, but rather a decree that would allow the Jews to defend themselves when all of these sleeper cells got activated on genocide day that had been determined by that roll of the dice. And indeed, this decree gets issued by the king, and all the Jews take up arms and they defeat the people who are trying to kill them. And it's this glorious day of victory, and God's chosen people are sustained, and the redemptive plan is going to continue to move forward. And then the book ends the way it begins, with a celebration, but this one is better. Instead of a drunken war council, it's the initiation of a new feast of celebration, the Feast of Purim, Pur being the name of those dice. What does it all mean when we add it up? Well, the master of fate is a God who doesn't even have to be mentioned to be providentially in control. Even when it seems like he's not there, he's still running the show. Who's the real king of kings? Not the easily influenced Xerxes, who thumps his chest and proclaims his titles at every opportunity. Not Haman, the schemer and the manipulator who's rotting on a stake somewhere. No, it's God. Even when he isn't mentioned, he is still king, and he's still the one who directs all of these things by his will and power. When you visualize Esther, picture Esther bravely going into the throne room uninvited. Picture Haman impaled on his own spike, and picture the roll of the dice, which will remind us of the big theme of Esther, which would seem to be God's providence over everything, even when he's seemingly not there. If for some reason you don't have time to go read the whole book, make sure you at least read chapter 4, where we get the very human interaction between Mordecai and Esther, and where she summons her strength and courage to go and fight for her people. I hope you've had a good time with this one. I have. Here's a high five. Congratulations for unlocking the Esther achievement. If you find this story to be interesting, please, please, please make plans when we're done with this series to join me for a crazy deep dive into the book of Esther. We'll be looking back into Ezra and Nehemiah and Persian history and all of this. As soon as we're done with the trip through the Bible, we're coming back to this, and this is going to be our long-term focus for our next big Book of the Bible series. All right, this was a blast. Thank you. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.